Hello, welcome back. At this point, we are going to take a deeper dive into the second theme of our series of webinars, competing commitments. So at this point, if you're jumping into webinar 5 and 6 and 7, you should have already gone through the first theme, which is white cultural practices and narrative features. Hopefully, after going through these webinars, you've had a chance to think through how white cultural practices and narrative features show up in your own life, and a chance to think about what that might look like to interrupt them for yourself and when coaching, engaging in others in coaching conversations. As we think through the white cultural practices and narrative features and how we can hold equity central to our work, we can begin to think through what a commitment is we want to make. And one would think that making a commitment would be an easy thing, but we see all the time that just naming a commitment, such as if we think of New Year's and resolutions and how those often work out, there are things that hold us back. So that's kind of what this next theme is. So the next theme will be broken into 3 webinars. Webinar 5 will speak to and give you a chance to use a tool to construct a commitment that you want to make as an individual. And then think through what are some of the competing commitments that may be holding you back from achieving this. Webinar 6 will look about the big assumption that you have, the fears that are holding you back, and then a chance to think through how you might test that big assumption. And then webinar 7, you'll see a sample coaching conversation where I walk a colleague and friend through a commitment they would like to make and how competing commitments and assumptions were showing up for them. So today we're really going to focus in on something called an immunity map. This is a tool that you'll want to have handy throughout this webinar so you can work on it. And it is part of a larger work called Immunity to Change. And I also want to just acknowledge that many of the slides used are adapted from Dr. Emery Pachauer, and some other content was adapted from Uncovering Your Immunity to Change from Executive Inspiration. Essentially, when we talk about competing commitments, we're talking about a lens through which we can view both technical and adaptive change. While technical changes are not necessarily easy or unimportant, the changes that we most often struggle with in life are those that are adaptive in nature. So I'm just going to read you a page from Immunity Change Introduction. Ronald Heifetz makes an important distinction that helps us summarize the central points we have made so far. Heifetz distinguishes between the 2 kinds of change challenges, those he calls technical and others he calls adaptive. Technical changes are not necessarily easy, nor are their results necessarily unimportant or insignificant. Learning how to remove an inflamed appendix or how to land an airplane with a stuck nose wheel are certainly important to the patient on the surgeon's table or to the nervous passengers contemplating a crash landing. They are, nonetheless, technical, because the skill set necessary to perform these complicated behaviors is well known. The routines and processes by which we might help an intern or novice pilot become an accomplished practitioner are well practiced and proven. While it is entirely possible that an intern or pilot in training will become qualitatively more complex over years of training, such mental growth is beyond the scope of their technical training. Novice surgeons, for example, become sufficiently skilled surgeons without anyone worrying about their adult development or mental growth. And here's the key. However, many, if not most, of the challenges you're faced today and will face tomorrow require something more than incorporating new technical skills into your current mindset. These are the adaptive challenges, and they can only be met by transforming your mindset, by advancing to a more sophisticated stage of mental development. And that's what we're really going to dig in the next webinar as we think through how we can begin to make those adaptive changes. So when we think about committing to something, I kind of already mentioned, it seems like it would be easy to accomplish. The reality is, though, is that we commit to things all the time. And just as often as not, we don't continue to follow through. This is often because we have competing commitments, as you see in this graphic representation. These competing commitments are built over a foundation of a big assumption. If we disrupt the balance between the two, something awful will certainly happen. Well, at least that's how we have it set up in our mind. So you can see when we make a commitment to something, we have something equally holding it back. And there's a fear that if we shift towards commitment, we will experience our big assumption, which we're going to talk a little bit more. Now, at this point, you're going to want to make sure you have access to the Immunity Map tool. You will see several boxes for you to engage in some reflecting and writing as we work through each of the steps. In that first column of your Immunity Map, you will identify your equity improvement goal and state it as the thing you are committed to. To prompt your thinking, consider this question. If you could get better at one thing that would make the most difference in your personal equity work, what would that be? Now, the context of the map may be within your work life, or it could be within your personal life. I actually have multiple maps that I'm working through. One is for work, and I have one or two other ones that I'm kind of walking through as to show in how I show up in my personal life. It is likely that you'll dig in this work, you will see there is an interconnectedness between the two as well. So again, here is that commitment. So in other words, what is that one big thing? One thing that if you change, it would transform you or your work. And take in mind some of these considerations. It should be important to you, should be true for you, and should be stated affirmatively. Let's take a minute to look at my example. My commitment in my work commitment, my equity commitment, is to challenge assumptions others hold about historically marginalized students. So a lot of my current work is around coaching teams, and I often hear biased remarks, implicit or otherwise, and I've historically left them unchecked. So one example I can think of is that I was working with a team and we were talking about parent engagement. And one team member essentially started talking that it was the parents' fault, that they never returned calls, that they weren't, they didn't find value in education. And then this comment kind of derailed the conversation and spiraled down deficit thinking into single stories, layered with single stories and not having parents present. Excuse me, parents or family present. One comment that really stuck out in my mind from this conversation was that comment that the parents don't care about education. I remember at that point trying to walk the conversation back, but I didn't really fully address the assumptions that were being made. So this is why I've chosen this commitment. So at this point, I would invite you to pause this webinar and think through that central question. I find it often helpful to just use this sentence stem to get me started. So again, this is time for you to draft and think through what is your one big thing. If you feel like you need more time than to step away or a day to reflect on this, that's fine. Just make a note somewhere of where you're stopping the video so you can rejoin here. After you push play again, we're going to move out of the yellow box. I'm sorry, we'll move into the yellow box, competing commitments. So take much time as you need to mull this over. This is space meant for reflection. Don't feel like it needs to be wordsmith perfectly at this time. If you've hit play on the webinar again, hopefully that means that you should at least have a draft of your commitment in the green box of your Munity map. As I said before, we're now going to be moving on to the yellow box, competing commitment. In the yellow box, we are going to do our best to identify our competing commitment or commitments. Think about what you are afraid would happen if you changed each of your current behaviors. If you're doing the opposite of what you're doing now, what fears or worries come up for you? Considerations is these competing commitments will preserve what you're normally doing. There's self-protection. They provide evidence to yourself why you think your current behaviors make sense. And they are in direct tension with your commitment, the green box. That one was really helpful for me as I thought through this. Once you have identified your fears, you can examine them from a different perspective. And you can see where your hidden commitments lie. You are committed to the green box, but you are equally committed to the yellow box. You're trying to establish that equilibrium based on your fears. And then based on your hidden commitment, of course, you would exhibit the behaviors that you may already currently be engaging in. I'm going to go back here. So this is my example again, and I want to say I had to spend quite a good bit of time in this yellow box, and it wasn't really until I talked through it with a friend and colleague that I realized I needed to pull back yet another layer in my competing commitments. So initially, I said my competing commitment was to maintain the coaching partnership. I had fears that if I pushed too hard or rocked the boat, that my coachees, the partnerships I was in, they may not want to engage in further work. And then essentially I was giving myself the permission that not engaging in deep work or engaging in no work at all would be worse than not engaging in deep work. So essentially I was saying, and that made sense, right? But the truth is that I wanted to be liked. And the way I would do that is I would continue to coach light. So when I held that commitment up to myself, it felt kind of gross. And that's kind of what this process does. It really should feel a little bit gross and hard and icky. Like I'm holding on to challenging assumptions being made about students and families so I'm liked. Is that who I really want to be? So this is going to end webinar 5. You should take some time to write down your fears or worries that come up for yourself and imagine yourself doing those opposite of column 2 behaviors. See if that helps you to identify your hidden commitment. I will say for me, in the 3 maps that I've completed, this was much more difficult than coming up with my commitment. So again, feel free to create some space and time for reflection, even if it means returning to webinar 6, where we're going to look at testing our big assumption at another time.